Welcome to life in Reedsburg during the 1930s. While the Great Depression dominated the decade, with lower crop prices and high unemployment, Reedsburg weathered the storm. Several capital projects were undertaken, including a school and hospital, and the population grew from 2,967 to 3,608. Two of the city's most magnificent homes were torn down. The famous War of the Worlds broadcast involved a former resident, and the generosity of a local benefactor took the city by surprise. These stories and more in Reedsburg in the 1930s.
Reedsburg-born cartoonist Claire Briggs died in New York City on January 3, 1930 at the age of 54. His 9 years in Reedsburg became the basis of his cartoons that were admired around the world. One of his most popular cartoon series was called The Days of Real Sport, that featured references to his childhood in Reedsburg. He even published a book by that name in 1913 which captured a year-long depiction of life in a small town through cartoons. His drawing career began in earnest in 1900 when he moved to New York at the age of 25 with his new bride, Ruth, and landed a job with the New York Journal, a William Randolph Hearst newspaper. When Hearst saw his drawings, he sent Briggs to Chicago. In 1903, he created the very first daily continuity comic strip. It was about a character named a piker clerk, who placed daily bets on horses in the Chicago races each day. The next day's strip would open with him having either won or lost the day before, all dependent on how the real-life horse did, and then it was on to the next bet. The strip put Briggs on the cartoon map, but it was cancelled in June 1904 because Hearst thought it was vulgar. From that point on, Briggs developed his cast of wholesome characters with their down-home sense of humor. He used the names of many of his childhood friends in the cartoons and placed them in scenes from his past memories, such as the old swimming hole. After 14 years in Chicago, Briggs went back to New York where he remained for his last 17 years. His popularity continued to grow. He turned out a dozen books of cartoons, put together a vaudeville act, lectured around the country, and made films. He wrote and produced 18 films for Paramount Studios in 1919. His cartoons were published in 125 newspapers around the country. One of his unheralded accomplishments was the formation of the National Flag Conference, which was held in Washington in 1923. The conference came about after he published a cartoon entitled, "I Wonder What the Flag Thinks About," in 1922. The cartoon caused a nationwide controversy on the improper way the American flag was used by the general population. Members of 67 of the largest patriotic organizations in the country participated in the conference and formulated a set of regulations for proper civilian use of the flag. His death at such a young age shocked his fans. Former President William Taft said, "He was one whose humor was not at the expense of anybody, but calculated to make everybody feel happy." Former Governor of New York, Alfred E. Smith said, "We lost a rare personality with a talent for gentle criticism of the common weaknesses of human nature." Briggs' ashes were scattered in New York Harbor.
The most generous benefactor in Reedsburg's history, died on June 1, 1938. Frida Myers-Nishon passed away a little after midnight after a long illness that kept her confined in a Madison hospital for 7 months. The bulk of her estate was set up in multiple trust funds designed to benefit the citizens of Reedsburg. Frida was the daughter of Mary Rudd's sister Clara. Frida came to live with Mary and husband David Rudd when she was 12 years old. Mary and Frida became inseparable after David died in 1896. For many years, the two of them spent most of their time traveling the country as well as Europe and the rest of the world. When Mary died in 1924, she left her entire fortune of $565,000 to Frida. The will was the largest probated in Sauk County up to that time. From that day forward, Frida began sharing her fortune in a multitude of ways. Turns out, she learned from Mary, for Mary's will also gave away her entire estate to benefit Reedsburg in the event Frida died before her. Frida's first major project was to build the parsonage for the Presbyterian Church, then gave it to the church along with a trust fund to be used for maintenance of the building. When the city was planning the new hospital on Park Street, Frida bought the land and donated it to the city. She also created a trust fund to help with the maintenance of the building. Frida married Edward Nishon in 1928. They had met in New York on one of her extended visits to that city. While they made their home in Reedsburg, it seems like they didn't spend a lot of time there. They traveled extensively throughout the country as well as the rest of the world. They packed a lot into the 10 years they had together. Her will established several trust funds to benefit the citizens of Reedsburg as well as those outside the area. Two of her trust funds distribute $50,000 a year each in the form of scholarships, one for Reedsburg High School graduates and the other pays the tuition of several nurses each year in Madison. She set up a $40,000 trust fund to be used by the hospital, half of the income for maintenance and the other half for care of the poor. Some of the funds took care of people in her family until they passed on, at which point, the funds were redirected to help others. Her largest donations went to the city of Reedsburg, which were used to help build the new City Hall in 1972 and Nishon Park in 1980. Frida left a mark on Reedsburg that will continue to benefit everyone that chooses to make Reedsburg their home.
One of the best-known Indian captives in the state of Texas died on August 10, 1936. Theodore Babb was the grandson of Reedsburg's first white settler, James Babb. Theodore, better known as Dot, was born in Reedsburg in 1852. His parents, John and Isabel, decided to move to Texas in 1854. They loaded up a covered wagon with their belongings and two children, 2-year-old Dot and 4-year-old Hernandez, also known as Court. A pair of horses were hitched to the wagon and they headed southwest for Decatur, Texas, 1,000 miles away. They spent the next 12 months on the trail. When they reached the Red River, the border between Texas and the Indian Territory, the river was in flood stage and, while they waited for the water to recede, the two brothers gained a sister. She was named Bianca. The family settled into a life of farming and cattle raising near Decatur. In the spring of 1865, John and his son Court, who was now 15 years old, drove a herd of cattle 200 miles to Fort Smith, Arkansas, leaving his wife and 3 young children at home. They didn't expect to return until October. A young widow by the name of Mrs. Luster was staying with the Babbs to help out while John and Court were gone. Life was more difficult without John and older brother around, but they managed. Then one day, it got bad. Real bad. Dot's words describes what happened that day.
Around 3 in the afternoon, my elder sister and I were at play when we discovered 35 or 40 Comanche Indians and all the regalia and war paint of the savage warrior. Stupefied with fright, we looked upon and realized that they were advancing rapidly. We wondered what our fate would be at the hands of these emissaries of murderous hate. We soon saw they would raid our home, and with their weird and unearthly war whoops ringing in our ears, we ran to the house for the protection of Mother and Mrs. Luster, who had also seen and heard the demons approaching. Mother had us enter the house as quickly as possible and closed the doors. It would be indeed impossible to describe the emotions of horror that possessed all of us in this moment of impending peril. Mrs. Luster undertook to conceal herself in the loft of the log cabin. I made for 3 old guns in their racks on the wall. Simultaneously, several of the Indians broke open the door, and as I would seize a gun, they would take it from me and beat me over the head with their quirts. My mother was trying to make friends by shaking hands with them, and against these overtures, they were unmoved as ever. The first thing in their diabolical performances was to plunder our home and take off everything in the way of clothing and bedding. They then had Mrs. Luster come down from the loft. She was bound by some Indians and taken outside. They grabbed my older sister and started off with her. My mother, prompted by an uncontrollable maternal instinct and affection, interfered and clung to my sister in an effort to prevent her from being taken. One of the Indians then stabbed my mother 4 times with a big butcher knife. They took my sister from the house and made a captive of her along with Mrs. Luster. Seeing my mother brutally and fatally stabbed, I helped her to the bed just as the Indians came back. Surprised my mother was not yet dead, one of them, with drawn bow, shot her in the left side with an arrow that ranged up towards her lungs. I pulled the arrow out and sat upon the bed with her. I did all I could to console and comfort her as her strength and life waned. The same Indian aimed a deadly arrow at me and commanded me to go with him. Mother, seeing that I too would be killed if I resisted or refused, said,
"Go with him and be a good boy."
One of them then grabbed me by the arm and jerked me off the bed and out the door. In this miserable plight I was forcibly separated from my mother, who was dying in a mass of blood while clasping the baby in her arms.
Neighbors arrived sometime later to find the 11-month-old baby playing in a pool of her mother's blood, unharmed. Mrs. Luster later escaped from her captures with Dot's help. And because of his bravery, the Indians decided not to kill him. It took John Babb 2 years to find his children and get them back. The 2 children had been separated, each living with a different tribe, which added to the length of time it took to find them. He paid a ransom of $600 plus some clothing and trinkets. The family returned to Reedsburg following the ordeal. However, the children eventually returned to the same part of Texas when they got older. Dot became a cowboy and spent most of his time in Amarillo, although at one point, he lived in Oklahoma for a year with his Comanche brothers on the reservation he had been kidnapped 2 years earlier. Dot wrote a book about his adventure entitled, In the Bosom of the Comanches. The Texas Highway Department has placed a roadside marker a mile west of Chico to commemorate the event and tell the story.
2 of the grandest homes in Reedsburg were torn down in the 1930s. The first one went on the chopping block when it was bought by the Perfect Oil Company in March 1931. The house had been built by Joseph and Cornelia Mackey 70 years earlier, around the time of the Civil War. It sat on the northwest corner of North Locust and Main Street and was the first site of the Reedsburg Bank, the bank started by Joseph Mackey and David Rudd in 1867. This corner was the center of the business district at the time. The area that became downtown was still marshy swampland and not yet suitable for buildings. The large brick building had a stable in the rear where carriage and riding horses were kept. A large formal garden was along the side. Son Frank Mackey owned the house after his parents died and returned for a week's vacation each summer for several years. Frank died in 1927 and was interred within the Mackey Mausoleum he had built in 1920 when his first wife Florence died. The house was also owned by the Henry Tiemann family for a while. One of the notable features of the house was the very elaborate wallpaper. The paper was an intricate medallion pattern. There were small colored figures on the paper, and these figures were dressed in small pieces of colored silk which had been firmly pasted to the paper. The second building was known as the Carver Mansion. It was located at 528 Main Street and was one of Reedsburg's most talked about landmarks. 2 sisters, Emma Carver and Catherine Young, each bought a lottery ticket in 1881. The lottery had a grand prize of $25,000 which was won by Emma Carver. She used $8,000 of the winnings to build the very large house on Main Street. As a side note, Emma's husband, Washington Carver, was the first Reedsburg man to enter the Union Army in 1861. He spent 9 months in the hospital recovering from a wound he received during the charge at Mary's Heights near Fredericksburg in 1863. The house was finished, but the Carvers never moved in. Like most lottery winners, they were besieged by relatives and other people asking them to share their newfound wealth. They shared so much of it that they ended up broke before they could move into their new house. Postmaster John Kellogg and his family were the first residents of the building before store owner John Hostler bought the house for his family. John died in 1914 and his wife Grace stayed in the house until her death in 1929. The building remained abandoned until 1936 when Frida Myers Nishon bought the building with the intention of tearing it down and selling the land, which she did. Alfred Bernian bought the property and built his house there. The Carvers relocated to Anaheim, California, and the Youngs relocated to Yankton, South Dakota.
We don't know how many may have barricaded themselves in their homes with a loaded shotgun in their lap, ready to repel an invasion from Mars, but we do know a former Reedsburg resident was involved in the panic. We are talking about the War of the Worlds radio play that was heard around the country the night before Halloween in 1938. Many believe the play to be a real news broadcast, and much of the country went into a panic, assuming the Martians had arrived to conquer the world. A former Reedsburg resident and future frequent visitor was involved in the play's production in New York City. Agnes Moorehead, whose father was the Presbyterian minister in town from 1919 to 1924, had joined the Mercury Theater when it was formed in 1937 by Orson Welles. While she performed in a number of radio dramas during the 2 years the Mercury Theater was in New York, she was not listed as a cast member in the War of the Worlds production. However, she was in the studio that night, answering phone calls.
I'm not sure, Miss Moorhead, were you in the War of the Worlds, the radio show that terrified most of New Jersey and part of the country? It's so funny, they've played it on radio since, and we talked about it once when Wells was here, but I mean, listening to it, the time sequence is impossible. I mean, a guy says, I'll come right to Princeton, New Jersey, and in 30 seconds he's there. And yet people took it as real, even with the fact that he would have to dematerialize and pop over there.
We answered so many phone calls, there, and it was so exciting. And I remember one phone call, this woman said to me, there are little green men in my backyard. There are little green men. I said, madam, it's just a story. It isn't. I see them. What am I going to do about it? Well, they were hysterical, all these phone calls.
And a lot of people wanted to know what to do. As a matter of fact, they were phoning us from all over the place, some of them reporting that they'd seen Martians landing in their backyards and asking for advice. And there were others that claimed to have been attacked personally by Martians. And the whole experience was extremely intense.
The massive negative response to the production convinced Welles his career was over. Turns out the opposite was true. Welles' publicity was recognized by movie studios in Hollywood. They wanted what he could deliver. Productions that would put people in theater seats. The company relocated to Hollywood the next year, where Welles made Citizen Kane, followed by The Magnificent Ambersons, 2 hit movies that also starred Agnes in her first feature films. The American Film Institute ranks Citizen Kane as the best movie of all time.
Former Reedsburg resident Len Kinnicky made the news in the summer of 1931 when it was announced that the New York Giants had paid $75,000 for him to play on their team. While expectations were high, he ended up back in the minor leagues by the end of 1932. He played in the minors through 1933 and was able to improve enough to capture the attention of Casey Stengel. Stengel, in his first season as manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, brought Kinnicky back to the majors for the 1934 season. His playing improved that year and expectations for next year's 1935 season were high. He started the season in 1935, but his hitting and fielding dropped off from the previous year and he ended up spending much of the season on the bench. Finally, he was sent home while the team was in St. Louis during a game in September. Worried that he might be traded, he proceeded to get drunk while on board an American Airlines plane headed for Detroit. He was disruptive on the flight and was thrown off the plane in Detroit. Determined to get to Buffalo, where he hoped he would be able to rejoin the minor league team, the Bisons, he chartered a private plane to fly him the 255 miles across Lake Erie. There was one other passenger and the pilot. Kinnicky managed to get in an argument with both of them and tried to take over the controls of the plane. In the midst of the brawl, the pilot hit Kinnicky on the head with a fire extinguisher, knocking him out. The pilot made an emergency landing at Long Branch Racetrack in Etobicoke, Ontario, Canada, where it was found that Kinnicky had died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Both the pilot and passenger were initially charged with manslaughter, but charges were eventually dismissed. Kinnicky was buried in Adams, where his parents were living at the time.
Farmer Ed Kruger, located west of town, narrowly escaped death in 1936 when a passing special fast express train sucked him off his feet. Ed had gone to the pasture on the other side of the tracks to bring the cows in for the evening milking. As the herd approached the crossing, he saw a train come out of the haze to the west. He held the herd in check, then stepped back from the south tracks to the north tracks as the train roared by. The suction from the train was so great that it pulled his feet from under him, causing his head to hit a rail. One cow was dragged 280 feet by the suction of the train. They later figured she was dragged by the suction since the path she made in the grass was at least 7 feet away from the rail and there were no marks on the dead animal. When Ed got up, he found 8 cows piled up in a heap, presumably knocked over by one of the 2 cows sucked along by the train. The headline read, "Girls hitchhike from Tulsa, Oklahoma, to Reedsburg in 3 days." What the headline didn't mention is that they were only 11 and 14 years old. These 2 sisters living in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 14-year-old Mary, and 11-year-old Peggy Welch, decided to go on an adventure. Their mother had talked about moving back to Wisconsin where she grew up. The girls had 2 aunts living in Wisconsin, one in Madison and another lived in Reedsburg. So, on a warm day in July, 1935, they headed out for their aunt's house in Madison. Fortified with 10 cents and a loaf of bread, the first leg of their journey got them to Springfield, Missouri, 200 miles away. They spent the night in a tourist camp. The next night, they ended up just east of St. Louis, another 250 miles further along. Their mother had sent some money for them to pick up at a hotel in St. Louis, but their ride took them through the city, so they didn't stop to pick up the money. The third leg of their journey brought them 400 miles to Madison, where they were able to connect with their Aunt Phyllis. They arrived at supper time with $2. They said that motorists had been generous with them. They said they didn't have to walk more than a mile along the entire journey. Aunt Phyllis brought them to her sister's, Sadie Camp, in Reedsburg, after supper. As a precaution to prevent getting sent back to Tulsa by the authorities during their time on the road, Mary had a note in her purse that had the name and address of Aunt Sadie in Reedsburg, so that anyone wishing to send them back to their parents would be sending them to their Aunt Sadie instead. One of the most recognized auto polo players, Carl Brady, stopped in Reedsburg while passing through in July, 1930. His mission was to visit old friends. Turns out, Reedsburg was Brady's hometown. He was on his way to the East Coast where his team would be playing several exhibition polo matches. Auto polo is played using cars instead of horses. The cars are stripped down with roll bars to protect the driver when they tip over, which happens a lot. Besides the driver, a mallet man concentrates on hitting the ball towards the goal. Brady was one of the best auto polo players in the country and had played matches throughout the country during his 16 years in the sport. The sport fizzled out in the early 1930s, largely due to the high cost of maintaining the cars. Besides auto polo, he worked in the pits at the Indianapolis Speedway on several occasions. He was there when the motion picture Speedway was filmed there. He was hired to play a mechanic for local color. He played a similar part in the movie Burning Up, the following year.
Several building projects were undertaken in the city during the 1930s. They included a new hospital, an elementary school, a church, a post office, a sewage plant, and a water tower.
Reedsburg's hospital closed on August 30, 1930. It was located at 153 Vine Street and was Reedsburg's second hospital. In a letter to the newspaper, Dr. Edwards, owner of the hospital, said he was closing due to his poor health. His attempts to sell or rent the property were unsuccessful. He did say he would still handle tonsil cases and emergencies and make a limited number of day calls in the city. The hospital reopened 6 months later in January, 1931 under the management of John Enday and his wife. They had the blessings and cooperation of area doctors and surgeons. By the summer of 1931, the city began to consider building a municipal hospital that would be operated by the city. An engineering firm presented a sketch for a 2-story, 25-bed building. The firm also visited several potential sites for the hospital. A 3-member hospital committee visited 7 hospitals between Richland Center and Burlington on a fact-finding mission. As a result of their research, it was determined a hospital could be built for $70,000. The city would issue bonds in the amount of $50,000, which would be purchased by the city's utilities from their surplus. An additional $19,000 was paid to the city from the utilities based on the city's equity in the utility plant. A referendum was scheduled for February 2nd in order to receive approval by the citizens that would allow the city to issue the bonds. A mass meeting was held the night before on February 1, 1932 at the Armory. It was well attended, and the next day, the referendum passed with 80% of the votes in favor, 1,053 to 203. Frida Myers-Nishon donated the site for the building known as Heaton Hill. The final design was for 2 stories plus a basement, 115 feet long, 36 feet wide on the south end and 40 feet wide on the north end. There would be 30 beds, a total of 6 single rooms, 7 double wards, 2 4-bed wards and 2 deluxe rooms. Construction began July 5, 1932 and opened for business on Monday, January 30, 1933. Over 4,000 people toured the building during an open house the weekend prior to opening. Plans for building a modern new school building at the South School location were underway in June 1935. The district wanted to move the elementary students from the high school to eliminate overcrowding in that building. A public auditorium was another consideration since there was nothing like it anywhere else in the city. Such a space would also allow for basketball games and other indoor recreation for the students. The public would be able to use the space for banquets and other events. The addition of a stage was included. The new school was dedicated on May 2nd and 3rd, 1937. It cost just over $172,000 to build, of which $39,000 was absorbed by the Works Progress Administration, also known as the WPA. The auditorium was put to use for Reedsburg's very first home show. The show took place during the weekend of March 4, 1938 and was pronounced a success. Displays of home furnishings, appliances, groceries and automobiles drew hundreds of interested residents to the South School auditorium despite the icy weather. The cars were arranged down the middle of the auditorium where they could be examined and sat in. The band mothers sponsored a refreshment booth where snacks and drinks were sold to raise money for the music department. In the spring of 1935, the state asked Reedsburg to take definite steps to build a sewage disposal plant due to the amount of sewage that was being dumped into the Baraboo River below the dam. In January 1938, the city purchased 24 acres of land east of South Park for $1,200. This was purchased as the new site for the city's sewage disposal plant. By 1938, the State Board of Health ordered the city to build the plant. The 2-year project called for the construction of nearly a mile of sanitary sewers, a lift station on the west side and the laying of 10,000 yards of blacktop. This was a Works Progress Administration project and the Public Works Administration provided a grant of $90,000. Freedy Brothers Company was the general contractor. The plant began processing sewage in November 1939. Monday morning, March 14, 1938, the brand new post office opened its doors for business. The building cost $70,000 plus $5,000 for the lot at the corner of 2nd and Walnut Streets. The new modern building was made possible through the efforts of U.S. Senator Ryan Duffy and Postmaster Louis Schultz. The majority of floor space was used to sort and stamp mail. The northeast end of the building was where the postmaster's office was located. The Reedsburg Post Office was established in 1849 and was located in various buildings in the city over the years. The last location was at 296 East Main before moving into their permanent quarters at 215 North Walnut Street. Senator Duffy dedicated the building in a ceremony in October. City Hall grew larger too. They expanded to the north when the building next door on South Park Street was purchased by the Utilities Commission. The Water and Light Department moved into the new area while the city clerk and treasurer remained in the south half. A new council chamber was built between the two offices. The new St. John's Church was dedicated over a 3-day period beginning Sunday, February 27, 1938. 2 services were held on Sunday along with a dinner and supper. Another service was held Monday night and on Tuesday night, an organ recital was presented. The church was filled to capacity for all 3 services as well as the recital. Over 1,200 people were served at the 2 meals on Sunday. It was a very celebratory weekend. It was just a year ago, on January 10, 1937, that St. John's Church burned to the ground. It was the oldest church building in town, having been built in 1878. A neighbor noticed smoke coming out at the edge of the roof at the rear of the church around 8:30 that Sunday morning. The 59-year-old building didn't take long to break out in flames too severe to douse. Replacing the 45-year-old water tower at the top of Brewery Hill became a priority in 1939. The 75,000-gallon tank was deemed to be unsafe due to its age. The new tank had a capacity of 200,000 gallons, was 25 feet high, 38 feet in diameter and would stand 114 feet tall. It was put into operation the 3rd week of December, 1939.